The ordinary courtroom day. It was a busy morning in the downtown courthouse. The echo of footsteps and murmurs filled the hallways as people shuffled in and out of courtrooms. Inside courtroom 7B, Judge Edward Harper adjusted his robe and glanced over the docket for the day. He was a stern, no-nonsense man known for his sharp tongue and swift decisions. To him, this day was no different from any other. Case after case, he listened briefly, made his judgments, and moved on. He prided himself on maintaining order and efficiency. The next case was called. The bailiff announced, case number 357, Miss Lauren Fields. A tall, elegant black woman stepped forward. She wore a simple yet professional black blazer and carried herself with an air of quiet confidence. Her expression was calm, unreadable even. As she approached the defendant's stand, whispers spread across the courtroom. "Who is she?" Someone murmured. "She looks important." "Doesn't matter. Judge Harper doesn't care who you are," another replied. Lauren stood straight, her hands resting lightly on the wooden edge of the stand. She didn't look nervous. If anything, she seemed almost too composed, which piqued the curiosity of everyone present. Judge Harper barely glanced up at her. To him, she was just another person in his long list of cases that day. "All right, Miss Fields," he began, flipping through some papers in front of him. "You've been cited for failure to comply with traffic regulations and disrupting public order. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Lauren looked directly at the judge, her eyes calm and steady. "No, Your Honor," she said simply. Her response took Judge Harper by surprise for a moment. Most defendants would scramble to explain themselves, offer excuses, or plead for leniency. But not her. "No defense," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "None, Your Honor," she replied. The courtroom grew silent. Even the spectators leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Judge Harper cleared his throat, deciding to proceed. "Very well. Based on the evidence and testimony provided, I'm issuing a fine of $500 and a warning to adhere to the laws moving forward. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lauren said, her tone steady, almost formal. Her calm acceptance unsettled Judge Harper. He wasn't used to this kind of behavior. Most people reacted with frustration or even tears when fined. But Lauren didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, pulled out a checkbook, and began writing without hesitation. The room watched in stunned silence as she tore the check from the book and handed it to the bailiff. "Is there anything else, Your Honor?" she asked politely. Judge Harper frowned. There was something about her tone, respectful yet firm, that he couldn't quite place. He shook his head. "No, you're free to go." Lauren gave a small nod, turned, and walked out of the courtroom. Her heels clicked softly on the tiled floor, fading as she exited through the heavy double doors. For a moment, the courtroom remained still. Judge Harper looked back down at his docket, trying to shake off the strange feeling the encounter had left him with. "Next case," he called, forcing himself to refocus. But as the day went on, he found his thoughts returning to Lauren Fields. Who was she? Why didn't she defend herself? And why did she leave with such quiet dignity, as though she knew something he didn't? Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Lauren stepped into the cool autumn air. She paused, looking up at the towering building behind her. Her face remained calm, but her eyes carried a glimmer of something deeper, determination. She adjusted her blazer and began walking down the sidewalk, her phone buzzing in her hand. She glanced at the screen. A message from a colleague appeared. Everything went as planned. Lauren typed back quickly, "Yes. Phase 1 complete." She slipped her phone back into her pocket and continued walking, disappearing into the crowd. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harper had no idea that his seemingly routine decision that morning was about to spiral into something far bigger than he could have imagined. Something that would leave the entire court, and himself, completely stunned. The courtroom was alive with its usual hustle and bustle. Lawyers shuffled their papers, defendants whispered nervously, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways. Judge Edward Harper sat at his bench, looking over the docket for the day. Known for his strict demeanor and quick judgments, he was a man who prided himself on his ability to keep order in his courtroom. It was just another ordinary day in what he considered a long career of dispensing justice. Case after case, he listened, ruled, and moved on without much pause. The rhythm of the courtroom was as familiar to him as the ticking of a clock. The bailiff stood tall and announced the next case, case number 357. Miss Lauren Fields. All eyes turned as a tall, composed black woman stepped forward. Dressed in a sharp black blazer, she moved with a quiet confidence that instantly captured the room's attention. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the nervous energy that usually accompanied defendants. As she reached the defendant's stand, there was a ripple of quiet murmuring among the spectators. "Who is she?" one person whispered. "She looks so composed." "Doesn't matter," another replied. "Judge Harper doesn't care about appearances." Lauren Fields stood with perfect posture, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the stand. Her expression was unreadable, calm but firm. She didn't look frightened, angry, or even embarrassed. She simply waited for the proceedings to begin. Judge Harper barely looked up at first. To him, she was just another name on the list, another case to close before the day ended. He cleared his throat and spoke in his usual brisk tone. "Miss Fields, you've been cited for failure to comply with traffic regulations and disrupting public order. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Lauren replied, her voice steady and clear. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" the judge asked, raising an eyebrow as he finally glanced up at her. "No, Your Honor," she said plainly. For a moment, the judge hesitated. Most people try to explain themselves, offering excuses or begging for leniency. Her calm refusal to defend herself was unusual. "No defense at all?" he asked again, his tone sharper this time. "None, Your Honor," Lauren replied, meeting his gaze without wavering. The courtroom grew still. The silence was thick, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath. Judge Harper frowned, slightly unnerved by her demeanor but unwilling to let it show. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the papers in front of him. "Very well," he said finally. "Based on the evidence provided, I am issuing a fine of $500. You are also being issued a formal warning to comply with traffic regulations in the future. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lauren said, her tone as steady as before. Her acceptance of the fine was almost too calm. There was no anger, no frustration, no plea for a reduced penalty. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a checkbook, and began writing. The spectators watched in silence as she tore the check neatly from the book and handed it to the bailiff without hesitation. "Is there anything else, Your Honor?" Lauren asked politely. The judge's frown deepened. Something about her tone, respectful yet unwavering, bothered him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. "No, you may go." Lauren gave a small nod, turned, and walked out of the courtroom with the same quiet confidence she had entered with. Her heels clicked softly on the tile floor, and the sound faded as she disappeared through the double doors. For a moment, the room remained silent. Judge Harper shifted in his seat, trying to shake the strange feeling that lingered after her departure. He quickly returned his focus to the next case, but the image of Lauren Fields and her composed demeanor stayed with him. Outside the courthouse, Lauren stepped into the crisp autumn air. She paused briefly, looking back at the building. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes carried a glint of something more, a sense of purpose. She pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping out a quick message. "It's done." Everything went as expected. As she walked away, blending into the city crowd, her figure vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions for those who had witnessed her. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harper had no idea that the day's seemingly routine decision was about to set off a chain of events that would leave everyone, himself included, completely stunned. The courtroom buzzed with its usual energy. Lawyers shuffled papers, defendants whispered nervously, and the air was filled with the faint hum of anticipation. Judge Edward Harper, seated firmly behind his high bench, scanned the list of cases for the day. He was a man known for his sharp decisions and unwavering focus on order. To him, this was just another day, another round of cases, fines, and rulings. The bailiff called out the next name, his voice ringing across the room. Case number 357, Miss Lauren Fields. The sound of heels clicking against the polished floor echoed as a woman stepped forward. Lauren Fields was tall and striking, dressed in a sleek black blazer with an air of quiet authority. She carried herself with a poise that turned heads in the courtroom. Conversations in the spectator seats softened to whispers. "Who is she?" One person muttered. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." "She's a defendant, same as everyone else," another replied dismissively. Lauren stopped at the defendant's stand, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. Her expression was calm, her gaze unwavering. She didn't fidget, didn't shift nervously as most people in her position would. She simply stood there, waiting. Judge Harper glanced up briefly before returning to the papers in front of him. To him, she was just another name, another case to deal with, and move on. "Miss Fields," he began, his tone brisk, "you are charged with failure to comply with traffic regulations and causing a public disturbance. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Lauren replied, her voice clear and measured. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" "No, Your Honor," she said calmly. Her response caused a ripple of surprise through the room. Defendants usually scramble to explain themselves, to argue their case or beg for leniency. But Lauren did none of that. She stood there, calm and composed, her answer simple and firm. "No defense at all," the judge repeated, his voice carrying a slight edge of curiosity. "None, Your Honor," she replied, her tone unchanging. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with intrigue. Even the judge, a man who prided himself on his ability to remain detached, couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. He adjusted his glasses and studied the papers before him, determined not to let his thoughts linger. "Very well," he said after a pause. "Based on the evidence presented, I am issuing a fine of $500. Additionally, you are warned to comply with all regulations moving forward. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lauren said. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out a checkbook. The room watched in silence as she carefully wrote out a check, tore it free, and handed it to the bailiff. Her actions were smooth, almost practiced, as if she had anticipated this moment. "Is there anything else, Your Honor?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The judge hesitated, sensing something he couldn't quite place. Her demeanor was unusual, respectful yet commanding, calm yet confident. He shook his head. "No, you may go." Lauren nodded slightly, turned, and walked out of the courtroom. The click of her heels on the tiled floor grew fainter until the sound disappeared entirely. Inside the courtroom, an unusual silence hung in the air. Judge Harper glanced down at his papers, trying to refocus, but the image of Lauren Fields lingered in his mind. Outside, Lauren stepped into the bright sunlight. She paused on the courthouse steps, taking a moment to glance back at the imposing building behind her. Her expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. She pulled out her phone, typed a brief message, and hit send. The screen read, "Everything went according to plan. Phase 1 complete." With that, she slipped the phone into her pocket and walked away, disappearing into the flow of people on the busy city street. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harper had already moved on to the next case, unaware that the seemingly routine encounter would soon unravel into something far bigger than he could have ever expected. The courtroom hummed with activity. Lawyers busily exchanged documents, the faint rustle of papers blending with the occasional low murmur of conversations. Defendants shuffled nervously in their seats, their eyes darting toward the stern figure seated at the bench. Judge Edward Harper presided over Courtroom 7B, his expression as sharp as ever. Known for his strict and efficient rulings, Harper prided himself on keeping his courtroom running like clockwork. For him, it was just another routine day. His docket was full, but none of the cases seemed particularly noteworthy. He scanned the next name on his list with practiced indifference. Next case, the bailiff called out. Case number 357, Miss Lauren Fields. The courtroom's usual hum quieted slightly as Lauren Fields rose from her seat and approached the stand. She was striking in her composure. Dressed in a sleek black blazer and carrying herself with an air of confidence, she looked out of place among the nervous, anxious faces that usually stood before the judge. The room seemed to notice it too. Whispers began to ripple through the spectators. "Who is she?" a voice murmured. "Doesn't matter. The judge doesn't care who you are," another replied. Lauren stood at the defendant's stand, her posture straight and steady. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, and her gaze never wavered. She seemed unfazed by the judge's reputation or the weight of the moment. Judge Harper barely glanced up at her, focused instead on the papers in front of him. "Miss Fields," he began in his familiar clipped tone, "you are charged with failure to comply with traffic regulations and causing a public disturbance. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Lauren replied, her voice calm and measured. The judge raised his head slightly, his gaze narrowing as he looked at her for the first time. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" "No, Your Honor," she said simply, her voice steady. Her response gave him pause. Most defendants launched into a flurry of explanations or excuses. They stammered, pleaded, or looked desperate for leniency. Lauren did none of those things. "No defense at all," the judge repeated, his tone carrying a note of surprise. "None, Your Honor," she replied. The courtroom fell silent. Even the spectators seemed to hold their breath, sensing that something unusual was happening. Judge Harper frowned slightly. There was something about her calm demeanor that unsettled him, though he couldn't quite place it. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the case documents again. "Very well," he said finally. "Based on the evidence presented, I am issuing a fine of $500. You are also warned to comply with all regulations moving forward. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lauren said, her tone as unwavering as before. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black checkbook. The sound of her pen scratching across the paper seemed loud in the stillness of the room. She tore the check free and handed it to the bailiff with calm precision. "Is there anything else, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. Judge Harper hesitated, caught off guard by her composure. It wasn't just her words, it was her entire presence, respectful yet unflinching, calm but with an undeniable strength. He pushed the thought aside, determined to maintain his focus. "No," he said, his tone brisk again. "You may go." Lauren gave a slight nod, turned, and walked out of the courtroom. The click of her heels echoed against the tiled floor, fading with each step until she disappeared through the heavy double doors. Inside, the silence lingered. Judge Harper stared down at his docket, but he found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept returning to Lauren Fields. Something about her left an impression he couldn't quite shake. Who was she, really? And why had she remained so calm? Outside, the cool afternoon air greeted Lauren as she descended the courthouse steps. She paused briefly, glancing back at the imposing building with an unreadable expression. Then, pulling out her phone, she typed a short message. "It's done. Everything is in place." Her phone buzzed with a reply moments later. "Good. Let's move to phase 2. Lauren slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking, blending into the city crowd. She moved with purpose, each step deliberate, as if she were following a plan only she fully understood. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harper returned his focus to the next case, unaware that his seemingly routine ruling had set in motion a chain of events that would soon rock his courtroom. and his life, in ways he could never have anticipated. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the case documents again. "Very well," he said finally. "Based on the evidence presented, I am issuing a fine of $500. You are also warned to comply with all regulations moving forward. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lauren said, her tone as unwavering as before. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black checkbook. The sound of her pen scratching across the paper seemed loud in the stillness of the room. She tore the check free and handed it to the bailiff with calm precision. "Is there anything else, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. Judge Harper hesitated, caught off guard by her composure. It wasn't just her words, it was her entire presence, respectful yet unflinching, calm but with an undeniable strength. He pushed the thought aside, determined to maintain his focus. "No," he said, his tone brisk again. "You may go." Lauren gave a slight nod, turned, and walked out of the courtroom. The click of her heels echoed against the tiled floor, fading with each step until she disappeared through the heavy double doors. Inside, the silence lingered. Judge Harper stared down at his docket, but he found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept returning to Lauren Fields. Something about her left an impression he couldn't quite shake. Who was she, really? And why had she remained so calm? Outside, the cool afternoon air greeted Lauren as she descended the courthouse steps. She paused briefly, glancing back at the imposing building with an unreadable expression. Then, pulling out her phone, she typed a short message. "It's done. Everything is in place." Her phone buzzed with a reply moments later. "Good. Let's move to phase 2. Lauren slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking, blending into the city crowd. She moved with purpose, each step deliberate, as if she were following a plan only she fully understood. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harper returned his focus to the next case, unaware that his seemingly routine ruling had set in motion a chain of events that would soon rock his courtroom and his life in ways he could never have anticipated. The courtroom buzzed with its usual energy. Lawyers adjusted their ties, defendants sat nervously, and the low hum of whispered conversations filled the air. Judge Edward Harper, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor and swift rulings, sat at his bench flipping through the day's docket. He took pride in his efficiency, treating each case as a box to be checked before moving to the next. "Next case," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the room. "Case number 357, Miss Lauren Fields." The shuffling in the courtroom stilled as a tall black woman stood and approached the defendant's stand. She walked with a calm confidence, her sharp black blazer and poised demeanor a stark contrast to the nervous energy that usually surrounded defendants. As she took her place at the stand, murmurs rippled through the spectators. "She looks like a lawyer or something," someone whispered. "No way. She's just another case," came the reply. "Judge Harper doesn't care who you are." Lauren Fields placed her hands lightly on the stand, her face calm and unreadable. She didn't fidget, didn't glance around. She simply stood there, waiting. Judge Harper glanced at her briefly before looking back at the paperwork on his desk. "Miss Fields," he began in his clipped, businesslike tone, "you are charged with failure to comply with traffic regulations and causing a public disturbance. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Lauren replied, her voice clear and steady. The judge paused, looking up at her fully for the first time. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" "No, Your Honor," she replied without hesitation. Her answer caused a stir in the room. Most defendants seized the opportunity to explain themselves, to offer excuses or plead for leniency. But Lauren didn't. She simply stood there, calm and composed, her gaze unwavering. "No defense," Judge Harper repeated, his tone laced with curiosity. "None, Your Honor," Lauren said evenly. A tense silence fell over the courtroom. Even Judge Harper, who had heard every excuse and explanation imaginable, found himself caught off guard. He adjusted his glasses and looked back down at the documents in front of him, his mind briefly distracted by her unusual demeanor. "Very well," he said after a moment. "Based on the evidence provided, I am issuing a fine of $500. You are also being warned to adhere to all regulations moving forward. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lauren said, her tone polite but unwavering. Without a trace of hesitation, she reached into her bag, pulled out a sleek black checkbook, and began writing. The faint scratch of her pen seemed loud in the stillness of the room. She tore the check free, handed it to the bailiff, and returned her gaze to the judge. "Is there anything else, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice calm yet firm. Judge Harper hesitated for a moment, thrown by her demeanor. Something about her confidence, her unflinching composure, unsettled him. It wasn't arrogance. There was no defiance in her tone. But there was an undeniable strength in the way she carried herself, as though she knew something no one else did. "No," he said finally, his tone brusque. "You may go." Lauren nodded once, turned, and walked out of the courtroom. Her heels clicked against the tile, the sound fading as she disappeared through the double doors. The courtroom remained unusually silent after her departure. Judge Harper shuffled his papers, trying to shake the odd feeling that lingered. Who was she? Why had she been so calm? He didn't have time to dwell on it. He had other cases to address. Outside, Lauren stepped into the bright sunlight, pausing briefly at the top of the courthouse steps. Her face remained calm, but her eyes held a quiet determination. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, typing a quick message. "It's done. Phase 1 is complete." Moments later, her phone buzzed with a reply. "Good. On to Phase 2. Lauren slid the phone back into her pocket and descended the steps, blending seamlessly into the bustling city crowd. Inside the courthouse, Judge Harper called the next case, unaware that the woman who had just left his courtroom was far from ordinary. What seemed like a routine judgment would soon spiral into an extraordinary revelation, one that would leave him, and the courtroom, completely stunned. The courthouse was bustling with activity, the usual hum of lawyers, clerks, and defendants filling the air. Judge Edward Harper sat at his bench, eyes scanning through the list of cases for the day. His reputation as a no-nonsense judge preceded him, and he took pride in his ability to handle case after case with efficiency and precision. For him, this was just another day at work, nothing out of the ordinary. The bailiff's voice cut through the room. "Next case, Your Honor, case number 357, Miss Lauren Fields." A wave of curiosity rippled through the spectators as a tall, poised woman stepped forward. Lauren Fields stood out. Dressed in a sharp black blazer, she moved with a grace that was unusual for someone standing in the defendant's dock. There was no hesitation in her step, no nervousness in her posture. She walked toward the stand as if she belonged there, like the courtroom was just another place she had visited many times before. The audience exchanged glances. "Who is she?" one whispered. "I've never seen her before," came the response. Lauren took her place, her gaze steady as she faced Judge Harper. The room fell silent as the judge began speaking, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Miss Fields," he began, not looking up at her immediately, "you've been cited for failure to comply with traffic regulations and for creating a public disturbance. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," she responded firmly. Harper looked up, giving her a quick glance. Her calmness struck him immediately. It was unusual. Defendants often squirmed or stammered when facing him, but Lauren stood there, composed and unwavering. "Do you have any explanation for your actions?" he asked, his tone more curious than stern. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Most defendants took the opportunity to explain, to defend themselves or offer an apology, but Lauren said nothing more. She simply stood there, almost as if she were waiting for the court to move forward. "No defense?" Harper asked again, His curiosity piqued. "None, Your Honor," she confirmed. A slight frown tugged at the corners of the judge's mouth. There was something about her presence that unsettled him, but he didn't allow himself to dwell on it. There were rules to be followed, and the case had to be decided. After a brief glance at the file in front of him, Judge Harper sighed. "Based on the evidence, I'm issuing a fine of $500, along with a formal warning to comply with all traffic laws moving forward. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lauren replied without hesitation. Without waiting for any further instructions, Lauren reached into her bag, pulled out a checkbook, and began writing. The soft sound of her pen scratching the paper filled the otherwise silent courtroom. She tore the check free and handed it to the bailiff with the same quiet confidence she had shown since entering the room. The judge blinked, momentarily taken aback. Most people hesitated when paying a fine, or at least appeared to be bothered by it. Not Lauren. She was as calm and composed as when she had entered. "Is there anything else, Your Honor?" she asked politely, her voice a steady and controlled calm. Harper hesitated, his mind running over the exchange. Her behavior was odd, almost too controlled. But he pushed the thought aside, unwilling to waste any more time on it. "No, you may go," he said, his voice clipped. Lauren nodded slightly, turned on her heel, and walked away, her heels clicking with a rhythmic precision against the tile floor. The courtroom watched in silence as she disappeared through the doors, the sound of her steps growing fainter with each passing moment. Inside the courtroom, a strange tension hung in the air. Judge Harper found himself momentarily distracted. He could not shake the feeling that something was off. Her presence had been unsettling, and he couldn't understand why. Outside, Lauren stepped into the crisp air. She paused briefly, looking back at the courthouse with an unreadable expression. Then, with a subtle motion, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She quickly typed a message, her fingers moving with purpose. "It's done," she wrote. "The plan is in motion. Phase 1 complete." The screen buzzed with a response almost immediately. "Excellent. We move on to Phase 2. Lauren slipped the phone back into her pocket, turned, and melted into the crowd of busy pedestrians. Her movements were deliberate, purposeful. She was on her way. Whatever the plan was, it had already begun, and nothing would stop it now. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harper had already moved on to the next case, but the quiet hum of his mind lingered on the strange encounter with Lauren Fields. He had no way of knowing it, but the seemingly routine exchange in his courtroom was just the beginning of something far more complicated, something that would soon change everything he thought he knew about justice and power. The courtroom was filled with the usual bustle, lawyers preparing their notes, defendants shifting nervously in their seats, and a low murmur of spectators filling the air. But amidst it all, Judge Edward Harper sat at his bench with the stern focus of a man who had seen it all. As the gavel came down, the next case was called. Case number 357. "Miss Lauren Fields," the bailiff announced, his voice slicing through the chatter. There was a subtle stir among the onlookers. Lauren Fields was a woman who commanded attention. Tall and composed, she walked toward the defendant's stand with a quiet confidence that immediately set her apart from the others who had passed through this courtroom that day. Her black blazer was sharp, her posture unshakable. For a moment, the room grew quiet. People began to whisper. "Who is she?" someone muttered under their breath. "She doesn't look like the usual defendant," another person whispered, but the whispers quickly faded as Lauren took her place at the stand. Judge Harper barely spared her a glance. He was a man who believed in efficiency, and he had a job to do. "Miss Fields," he began, his voice sharp, "you stand charged with failure to comply with traffic regulations and causing a public disturbance. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Lauren responded without hesitation, her voice calm and steady. Judge Harper looked up at her for the first time. There was something about her composure that felt out of place. Most people who came before him in court were nervous, defensive, even desperate. But Lauren Fields was entirely different. She stood there, a picture of quiet control. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight edge of curiosity. "No, Your Honor," she said, her words measured and precise. A silence fell over the courtroom. The judge blinked, slightly taken aback. He had expected some kind of explanation, some excuse or plea for leniency, but Lauren offered nothing. It was almost as if she was unbothered by the proceedings, as if she knew exactly how this would unfold. "No defense," he repeated, his tone slightly incredulous. "None, Your Honor," Lauren confirmed, her gaze unwavering. Judge Harper stared at her for a moment, something unsettling flickering in his mind. He returned his attention to the case file in front of him, his fingers briefly grazing the documents. He had seen thousands of defendants, but something about Lauren Fields was different. "Very well," he said finally, trying to shake the strange feeling. "Based on the evidence, I am issuing a fine of $500 and a warning to comply with all traffic regulations in the future. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied promptly. Without so much as a pause, Lauren reached into her bag, pulled out a checkbook, and began to write. The motion was smooth, practiced. She tore the check from the book and handed it over to the bailiff, all without a second thought. The judge couldn't help but watch her. Most defendants hesitated, sometimes even argued over a fine. But not Lauren Fields. She paid the fine with the ease of someone who had done this countless times before. "Is there anything else, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice polite but direct. Judge Harper hesitated for a moment, wondering why he couldn't shake the odd sense that something was off. She wasn't acting like anyone he had ever seen in his courtroom. But he pushed the thought aside, unwilling to waste more time. "No," he said finally. "You may go." Lauren nodded, turned, and walked away with the same steady confidence. Her heels clicked against the floor as she exited the courtroom, the sound growing fainter until she was gone. Inside, the courtroom returned to its usual rhythm. Judge Harper moved on to the next case, but his mind kept drifting back to Lauren Fields. Who was she, really? Why had she acted so composed, so unfazed by the proceedings? Outside, Lauren stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, pausing to take in the busy street before her. Her face was a mask of neutrality, but her eyes betrayed a glimmer of determination. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, typing a short message. "It's done. Everything is set for Phase 2. The reply came almost instantly. "Good. We move forward." Lauren tucked her phone back into her pocket and continued down the steps. She blended seamlessly into the crowd, her movements purposeful. She had a plan, and this was just the beginning. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Harper called for the next case, unaware that the seemingly ordinary fine he had just imposed would lead to a revelation that would shake him to his core. What appeared to be a simple, routine day in court was about to become something far more complicated and dangerous.